Hello, everyone. Welcome to another Dolphin Communication Project webinar. We are very excited about today's playful topic. What does object play tell us about creativity? And we're very excited to publicly congratulate our student Abby Adams, who recently graduated from the Charismatic Megafauna and Oceanography Lab at Nova Southeastern University. Congrats, Abby. Um, and her paper will be out. And when it is, you will, of course, hear DCP shouting from the rooftops. And we'll make sure anyone who wants access to the publication gets it. But this is a pre-publication talk about her work. And so for everyone, I'm just going to give Savannah a minute to join. As you know, this is being recorded, so if you're listening live, please submit your questions to the chat. And if you are listening to a recording, thank you very much. And maybe we'll see you at a live talk one day. If you have questions, feel free to reach out to us on social media or shoot us an email. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Abby.
Okay. Hi guys. As she said, my name is Abby and I just finished my master's at NSU. Um, so hopefully you guys can see everything. So as we mentioned, I'm talking about play in dolphins and what object play tells us about their creativity. So the first thing you're probably wondering is what is play? So play has been studied extensively in many animal species, with birds, reptiles, some fish species, but most often in mammals. However, defining play remains challenging because it occurs in so many forms and contexts. But in general, we can say that play in non-human animals is a voluntary and repeated behavior. It occurs when they're in a relatively relaxed state. It's not immediately functional to them, but it has been said to contribute to motor development, social competence, and adaptability to future challenges. Since play is so challenging to define, one of the most used frameworks for defining play in behavior is by Burkhardt, and he said 5 characteristics for play. His 5 characteristics are that play actions are not completely functional to the animal. They are spontaneous, they are voluntary, they're pleasurable, or they're self-directed. They differ from the survival-based behaviors in both their structure and their context. They are expressed repeatedly, and they also occur when the animal is in a relatively relaxed state. And it's important that we have this distinction because it makes play a meaningful category in behavior and allows us to distinguish it from other behaviors such as foraging or tool use. The In general, play is divided into 3 different categories. So locomotor play, social play, as well as object play. Locomotor play is going to be any exaggerated movements like jumping, leaping, prancing. It has been seen in horses, as well as cheetahs, deer, squirrels, and primates. Social play requires more than 2 individuals. It can include chasing, play fighting, sexual play, and it's often common among the juveniles as it may contribute to their social development as well as their relationship formation. The focus of this study, though, was object play, which is the interaction with inanimate objects, and the manipulation of them, whether they are natural or man-made. So why choose object play? Although object play can sometimes resemble tool use, it differs in the functional purpose, where tool use involves the manipulation of an object to accomplish a goal, such as obtaining food or modifying the environment around the animal. Object play is exploratory and non-functional in the immediate sense to them. So, for example, chimpanzees can use sticks to get honey or termites for food, and bottlenose dolphins in Shark Bay, Australia, have used sponges to cover their rostrums when foraging. But object play is different because the interaction appears to be the goal. So this may support exploration of their environment, behavioral flexibility when interacting with the objects, as well as skill development as they age. So looking at dolphins specifically, dolphins can interact with many, many kinds of objects, bubbles, leaves, coral, rocks, seaweed, pretty much anything they can find in their environment. So some examples of object play in dolphins, as you can see in this video, the dolphins are passing a piece of seaweed between each other. So this would be social object play, but they can carry them, they can toss them, they can pass them, manipulate them, pretty much whatever they can grab, bite the objects. So, looking at creativity, though, it's important to understand how we define it in humans before we try to define it in dolphins. So, creativity is the ability to generate responses that are both novel and appropriate to a given situation or problem. And one of the frameworks that we use in humans is called the Torrance test of creative thinking, which evaluates creativity using four different categories, which is fluency, elaboration, flexibility, and originality. Fluency is going to refer to the number of responses that are being generated. Flexibility is going to be the variety of those responses. Elaboration reflects the amount of detail or the complexity or the expansion on that idea. And then originality evaluates how unique or uncommon that idea is to the other ones that have occurred. And even though these were made for humans, it is been explored whether similar concepts can be applied to looking at creativity in non-human animals. And for the purpose of this study, I focused on fluency and elaboration. Moving into animal creativity, research on creativity in animals is relatively limited, and generally it's looking at innovation or problem solving in animals. So some examples of that could be the hyena in the photo at the top who's interacting with a puzzle box that has food in it, as well as the blue tit at the bottom. The blue tits are famous for what they call a milk bottle behavior, where they learn to open the tops of creams in Britain and access the cream at the top. And then outside of that, octopi have also showed cognitive flexibility in a series of problem-solving events. Like in this video, they were able to adapt to their surroundings and get out of each puzzle box. But much less is known about the creativity that is expressed through spontaneous behaviors like play. And so even though innovation and creativity are relatively similar, they're not completely identical. So dolphin creativity, dolphins have exhibited a lot of innovative foraging strategies in the wild. Some of those examples include the sponging that I already mentioned in Shark Bay, Australia, where they cover their rostrum with the sponge while foraging. There's also conch shell carrying, as well as mud ring feeding. There's a really cool one called kerplunking, crater feeding is also another one that occurs, strand feeding that occurs in large dolphins like killer whales, as well as in smaller dolphins, as well as ice float hunting that also occurs in killer whales. So all of these behaviors are demonstrating behavioral flexibility and ingenuity, but they're different from play because they're serving a clear survival related function. So previous dolphin creativity studies have used a trained create paradigm, which is that a dolphin is asked to perform a behavior or produce a novel behavior in response to a cue that they are given. So researchers then evaluate how varied or complex the responses become as the study goes on, depending on how it is. And this began with Pryor and colleagues in 1969 and has continued through more recent studies. And dolphins have repeatedly demonstrated that they do have the ability to produce novel responses on cue. And even though this is providing really strong evidence that they have the cognitive capacity for creative behaviors, it's leaving a gap in our understanding of can dolphins demonstrate creativity without being asked to do so, because these studies are relying on training and reinforcement. They're not may not be fully capturing what is being expressed naturally. And so object play may provide a natural context for us to evaluate creativity. So for my study, my research questions, the big overarching question was, can object play serve as a proxy for creativity? And then furthermore, I asked, do dolphins exhibit behavioral fluency as well as do they exhibit behavioral elaboration? And then also, does object play vary by sex, by age, and then furthermore by population? So my predictions were that the younger dolphins would exhibit greater fluency, as well as the older dolphins would exhibit greater elaboration. And then I also predicted that the males would engage in more frequent object play than females. So looking at my methods, the two groups that I looked at, the first group was a bottlenose dolphin group in RIMS at Bailey's Key in Roatan. And DCP has conducted long-term behavioral research at both of these locations for more than 2 decades. And so this allowed me to look at object play across two different populations. The second population is a population of Atlantic spotted dolphins out off the coast of Bimini in the Bahamas. And for this, I was looking at archival video data that DCP provided to me. So a little bit more about these populations. At RIMS, it was the group of bottlenose dolphins. They are a managed care group of dolphins. They are housed in that natural lagoon that you just saw. During my study, there is roughly 17 to 18 dolphins, depending on the year. And these dolphins are very much human habituated between routine care and husbandry, as well as structured interaction programs that occur. The dolphins at Bimini are Atlantic spotted dolphins. They are a wild population on a shallow sandbank habitat. During this period that I looked at, there was roughly 117 individuals that have been cataloged by DCP. These dolphins are also human habituated just from having researchers and snorkelers around in the water with them. So for data collection, all of the data was collected by DCP using a mobile video acoustic system and a standardized underwater behavioral observation. So it followed a focal follow method combined with all occurrence sampling. So that's when the person operating the camera follows the first dolphin that comes into view until that dolphin leaves. And then after that, the video is all processed in Boris, which is a behavior coding software. And so when I was looking at events in Boris, I was recording object play events when a dolphin interacts with an object, and then adding the sequences of actions that were occurring to be able to look at elaboration. So object play began when the dolphin interacted with an object and then showed interest in it, and then it was complete when that dolphin disengaged or stopped playing with the object. The actions that I was putting in for elaboration could include rubbing, throwing, dropping, shaking, mounting, catching, just to name a few. And I was sequencing those in the order that they were happening during that object play bout until that object play bout ended. For my statistical analysis, looking at fluency, I was looking at the single actions that I just mentioned, as well as the differences in object types. So whether they are playing with leaves, bubbles, coral, or grass. And then I made those comparisons across sex, age, and population. So for both populations, I further categorized the age into older and younger, just for reference later on in the presentation. The older dolphins are going to be C3 to C5 at Bimini, as well as subadult and adult at RIMS. And then the younger dolphins are calves and juveniles at RIMS, and then C1s and C2s at Bimini. Because most of my categories in fluency had small sample sizes, I had to use some different tests to get things to work well. So for elaboration, that was looking at, again, at the organization of the sequences. So for that, I use lag sequential analysis, which looks at the single action transitions. So it's taking the observed transition versus the expected transition, and then looking at the Z-score to determine if a behavior was happening more than expected by chance. So the first thing I was looking at was lag 1, which is from behavior A to behavior B. And so that's looking at every successive behavior, so from carry to drop to another behavior. And then furthermore, I looked at lag 2 analysis, which is A to C. So that's a behavior A and behavior C with one intervening behavior. So if a dolphin carries an object, how likely are they to drop it 2 behaviors later in that sequence? Unfortunately, because I had few long sequences, I couldn't go higher than a lag 2. So there's no lag 3 or higher because it creates a sparse transition matrix, and then it reduces the statistical reliability of it. So elaboration, I then visualized diagrams with the z-scores. So I was able to do the lag 1 and the lag 2 and do by sex, age, and by population. So when you see these later on, the circles are the single actions, the arrows are significant transitions, and then a thicker arrow is going to correspond to a stronger association or a behavior that's more likely to happen after the first behavior, more than expected by chance. So in total, I reviewed around 25 hours of video across both populations. I documented 432 object play events. 334 of those were at RIMS, 98 were at Bimini. I analyzed a total of an hour and 23 minutes of object play. Roughly 55 of that was at RIMS, and roughly 28 was at Bimini. And the mean bout duration at RIMS was 9.8 seconds, while at Bimini it was 17.5 seconds. And so the object play bouts at Bimini were significantly longer than the ones that were occurring at RIMS. So this is a lot of numbers, but looking at fluency first, I examined it by sex. So at RIMS, the behavioral distributions were differing significantly between the males and the females. The males were performing more jawing and more biting frequently when playing with objects, um, and using more of the oral exploration and playing with the objects, whereas the females were doing more of transporting and manipulation, such as like carrying objects as well as pushing them. And then looking at Bimini, there was no significant sex differences that were detected. However, this is probably mainly because my sample size for males was 4 individuals, which makes it more cautious looking at these differences. The females tended to carry, bite, and chew. They were also manipulating objects. And the males had some interactions that were occurring, but much less because, again, I had a small sample size. Looking at them by age, RIMS had age-related differences. The younger dolphins were jawing and biting objects significantly more than the older dolphins. The older dolphins, again, were showing more manipulation, so the carrying and pushing again. At Bimini, again, no significant differences were being detected. The younger dolphins did a lot of variation between carrying, catching, chasing, as well as jawing, but the trends were relatively weak. Looking at their object diversity by sex, at RIMS, the object use differs significantly between the males and the females. The males at RIMS very much love to interact with Kathleen's fins. So that was about 81% of their object play interactions, whereas the females tended to interact with more of the natural objects, such as leaves or seagrass. At Bimini, again, no significant differences were detected, but seaweed was the main category that they played with. More so, I think, because of the object availability in their habitat, not necessarily a lack of playing with different objects. Looking at it by age, unlike sex and age, there was no significant difference associated with object type by age. At RIMS, again, they frequently interacted more with Kathleen's fins than any other object, but they also interacted with seaweed. The older dolphins were interacting with a variety of different objects. And again, at Bimini, I was seeing seaweed as that main category that they were playing with for both younger and older dolphins. So then before looking at the sequences themselves, I wanted to look at the variation among the individual dolphins. So I had a variation in both the frequency and the complexity of the object play sequences. Some dolphins had longer sequences, or many short sequences. The number of sequences range from 1 to 30. So the two that were at the top were Stan and Champ with 29 and 30 sequences, and followed by Lenka and Dory with 21 and 15 sequences. The average number of behaviors was generally between 2 to 3 behaviors for most, but it did get higher for several females. So Callie, Gracie, Polly, and Tilly had some of the more longer as well as most behaviorally diverse, meaning they had more behaviors that were different within each sequence that I was looking at. And then looking at Bimini, there was a similar pattern. There was individual variation among the ID dolphins. Dolphin number ID number 94 had the most sequences with 11 sequences, as well as the most total time in sequential play, around 5 minutes of play, followed by C2, which is a composite group of C2 individuals. So there's going to be more sequences because those are dolphins that could only be identified by age, not by an individual ID. So there was also, again, dolphins that had shorter sequences as well as some that had longer. Some of the ones that had longer ones were ID 101 as well as younger male. And then again, another C2 composite group. And then they also had differences in the average 3 to 5 behaviors. 22 and 99 had some of the higher ones. 22 had the highest with 8 behaviors in one sequence, as well as 5 different behaviors that occurred in that sequence. And so these are the diagrams that I mentioned before. So after looking at the individual variation, I wanted to look at how they were organized within each group as well as each demographic group I was looking at. So at RIMS, the object play was more structured between the transport and the oral behaviors as well as object retrieval. So when you're looking at the diagram, you can see that they were pushing to carrying objects. They would carry to drop them. They would often orient to push an object as well as touching to pushing. Dropping was often followed by then catching an object. And then looking at Bimini, theirs was more directed from the gaze orient behavior. So they would gaze orient and then chase an object, or they would orient towards it and then bite it, as well as they also had the transport and manipulation. So they would drop an object and then furthermore carry it, or the reverse, or they would shake an object and then drop it, as well as carrying to shaking an object. So looking at elaboration by age, the Rams dolphins, the older dolphins exhibited a greater number of significant behavioral transitions compared to the younger dolphins. The younger dolphins had repeated throwing and rubbing behaviors, whereas the older dolphins had a lot more of the manipulation behaviors occurring, so dropping to catching and a transport, as well as pushing to carry. At Bimini, the younger dolphins had slightly fewer significant transition or slightly more transitions than the older dolphins. But they both had some repeated behaviors like rubbing as well as the bite, chew, nibble, and then more of the manipulation behaviors. I think I skipped one by accident, but so looking at lag 2 by sex, the RIMS dolphins, the lag 2 allowed me to look at what was the separation of one behavior to a behavior to two behaviors later. At RIMS, the females had substantially more lag 2 uh, behaviors than the males did. They had a lot of repeated behaviors, which by that I mean that they would rub an object and then they would have another behavior occur and then they would rub it again. So they were frequently returning to the same behavior after the intervening behavior. And then looking at Bimini, females had slightly more significant lag 2 associations than the males, but the difference was less pronounced than at RIMS. And then looking at it by age, the older dolphins at RIMS had more significant lag 2 transitions than the younger dolphins. The younger dolphins had fewer, they had repeated behaviors like rubbing or throwing. And again, this is separated by an intervening behavior. So they're returning to what the first behavior that was occurring after the intervening one. At Bimini, it was the opposite. The younger dolphins had significantly more lag 2 transitions than the older dolphins did. And they had a more variety of actions that were occurring after the initial behavior occurred, and then the one that occurred 2 behaviors later. So what's important looking at the results is that I just look at what they mean in the context of creativity. So the goal here wasn't to determine whether they're inventing entirely new behaviors. Instead, I was looking at whether the spontaneous object play exhibits characteristics that we associate with creativity, specifically in the fluency and elaboration. So the RIMS dolphins produce more object play events. They also had a greater diversity of objects compared to Bimini, who had longer object play bouts, but they were predominantly interacting with just seaweed. Um, but I think the reason the Bimini dolphins were interacting more with seaweed is because that was what was available to them in their habitat, because they have a shallow sandbank habitat that was the object that tended to be available. Whereas at RIMS, they're off the coast of a shore where they have things that can come into their lagoon and they have coral and rocks. So there's more objects variety for them to interact with. So I did observe individual variation in both populations, as well as there was a difference in the frequency of play that was occurring, as well as the complexity of the sequences was differing among the dolphins. So at RIMS, there were significant sex and age differences, as well as object preferences differing by sex. The males had more of the mouthing and jawing behaviors, whereas the females had more transport and manipulation. The older dolphins, again, more manipulation, whereas younger dolphins had more of the mouthing and the jawing and biting of objects. At Bimini, there was no significant sex or age in behavioral distributions. Again, seaweed-dominated object interactions happen across all of the demographic groups. But the interpretation here with Bimini is important to know that there is small sample sizes and a largely unknown sex and age classifications, which makes it harder for me to say confidently that there would big differences between each group. So unlike fluency, which was focusing on the diversity and the frequency, the elaboration was looking at how those behaviors were organized. So the object play was organized into structured behavioral sequences in both populations, and all of the behaviors were linked into predictable pathways. So RIMS had both significant lag 1 and lag 2 behavioral sequences, so did Bimini. RIMS was frequently transitioning among transport behaviors and manipulation, as well as re-engagement. Bimini had longer bouts with these same objects, but they also had fewer lag to associations that were observed, which just means that there was less longer sequences that could be looked at. Looking at differences by sex and age, the females across both had more significant lag 2 behavior associations. There was more evidence of extended sequences. They also had a more structured behavior organization, whereas the males were showing fewer significant lag 2, and they had relatively simpler sequences during object play. The older dolphins had a more consistent sequence structure, and there was a greater number of those transitions at lag 2 for RIMS. Whereas with younger dolphins, they had more variable behavioral combinations occurring, as well as more repeated behaviors at lag 2, and there was more significant lag 2 behaviors occurring at Bimini in the younger ones than the older ones. So looking at them together, this is supporting the idea that creativity does not require entirely novel behaviors. It can emerge through behavioral flexibility, the recombination of those behaviors that they had, as well as a structured variation in the behavior sequences. So they had spontaneous multi-step sequences. This was not a trained or asked to do a behavior on cue with external reinforcement. This was completely natural. So this is looking at it in a voluntary and exploratory way, and it's providing that natural context for examining creativity as it occurs in their everyday behavior rather than asking them to do something. So in conclusion, the dolphins did demonstrate behavioral diversity with fluency as well as structured behavioral sequencing with elaboration. They did have multi-step behavioral chains that suggest flexible recombination of behaviors. They had individual variation indicating that they did not rely on fixed action patterns. They would often change them. The findings here are supporting the idea that dolphins can generate complex behavioral outputs without external prompting. And ultimately, here, this study expands our understanding of dolphin cognition by showing that spontaneous object play may provide valuable insight into how creativity is expressed in non-human animals and may serve as a proxy for creativity in dolphins. And that is all I have.
Thank you, Abby. Sorry about that delay. I hit the wrong button. Um, Thank you very much. Before we get to questions, I am just going to steal the screen for a minute, um, and remind everyone listening eventually, that this was a DCP webinar. And if you have already listened to them all, we thank you. And if you haven't, you can find all of the recorded programs on our website, dolphincommunicationproject.org, and just look under the Knowledge Hub. You will find webinars. If you prefer YouTube or even Vimeo, they are all available there as well. This was a deep dive, so are you awake? Abby did not shy away from the statistics, and things like that. A little longer, a little deeper. We also have dolphin lessons that, though they are geared toward younger ages, they are really for everyone, the young at heart. They're a little shorter and a little simpler. And then we also have our podcast, The Dolphin Pod, and that is all those episodes are also available directly on our website or wherever you get your podcasts. And a little teaser, we should have a new episode coming out sometime this fall, so stay tuned. And of course, DCP is a nonprofit, so I would be remiss if I didn't remind everyone how they could support us. And while there are lots of ways to support with your piggy bank, becoming a dolphin protector, a member, heading over to our friends at Stream to Sea to get great reef-friendly body care products. You can also support us just by staying in touch, following us on social media, sharing information, whatnot. We really want more and more people to get access to accurate information about dolphins, and we hope that it inspires everyone to help protect their ocean home. So with that, we have time for questions. Abby's caught her breath and had a sip of water. Now we can inundate her with questions. So one question is if you noticed any similarity in how the two different groups interacted with the seaweed, since that was the object that was in both groups. If there wasn't any similarity, why do you think there wasn't?
I wasn't seeing any differences and like they were performing the same interactions with objects. Seaweed just happened to be the one that occurred in both populations. Again, I think it's because of the availability of seaweed to Bimini because of the habitat that they're in. So if there was occasional moments where they had trash or other objects, but seaweed was that main object. And most of the time in both populations, I was seeing that Rams dolphins and Bimini dolphins, they would be carrying the seaweed. They could drop it. If it was a social interaction, it would be they would drop it and then another dolphin would come in and pick it up, whether that be on a peck fin, on a fluke, or if they would catch it in their mouth, in their rostrum. And there was a lot of interactions of the shaking and swapping it between body parts, but it was relatively the same between both populations. It just happened to be the object that occurred across both.
Mhm. Thank you. You mentioned kind of playing with it by themselves or versus a second dolphin coming in. So that segues to a question. The statistics that you included, the counts, the sex comparisons, the age comparisons, were those just looking at solo play, a specific individual playing, or did were the shared play, was that included?
So the solo versus the mutual wasn't included. So um it wasn't a factor that I looked at and how it related to the sequences that were occurring. That would be a future thing to look at, would be how are these sequences occurring outside of just one dolphin? So these sequences could initially have, because that was one of the variables I was looking at and I would put into the bores when I was coding them. But it wasn't one that I looked at in relation to the object play or the creativity. But in the future, that would be a category to look at.
Did you see any behavior that could be considered a dolphin teaching another dolphin a behavior to play with the objects?
Um, not, that's not necessarily, I don't want to say that I did because I'm not sure what they're thinking. So, um, I mean, with the younger dolphins, it did seem like because they had what I'm seeing with the diagrams is that the younger dolphins were having more variation depending on the population in their activities, where like some of the older dolphins might be doing the same behaviors, not necessarily because they're just repeating the same behaviors over and over again, but it's hard to know if like maybe they like doing that behavior over and over with that object and that's something they want to do. And so that's why they just have similar sequences occurring. I don't know if that answers that.
Thank you. And we have compliments to you about how excellent your presentation itself was. And a question about sand. And if at any point in this it's helpful and you want to throw your slide back up, feel free. You excluded sand from Bimini as an object to play with. If you had included it, what do you think you might see in how it would be used?
Um, and when I was watching even though it was excluded, the main reason it was excluded was because, generally speaking, I couldn't see an object being interacted with. So it would be hard to know if they were foraging for an object or playing with the sand itself because sometimes, at least at Bimini, sometimes with the sand, it was too far away for me to be able to see. And if I can't confirm that the object is there, then I can't say that object play is occurring because I don't want to falsely say that that's happening. Um, I think they probably do play with sand. It's an object in their environment. I did see a lot of the times if they, even though I wasn't documenting it, they would occasionally rub their flukes in the sand back and forth. So I don't know if they're playing or maybe they're just rubbing their flukes because they like the sensation of it. Not really sure, but that was a frequent one that was occurring. But it just was excluded because I couldn't see the object from
How
the
did
camera
Rim's
angle.
dolphins play with sand?
I didn't see a lot of sand play
Mm.
occurring. It was a lot of leaves, seagrass, mainly leaves.
Mhm.
A lot of Kathleen spins. That was a lot of the video, especially with the boys. So I think it just has to do with what they feel like playing with at the time or like what's available to them. And because Rims has a more dynamic habitat where they have more options, whereas Bimini, they kind of what was there. If it was floating, they could play with it. If there was a couple times that was trash, but
Mm-hmm. Yeah, which may look fun in the moment, but no, we would rather they not have the option of playing with litter humans. So throw your garbage away, secure your garbage properly. Um, how many years of data or field seasons or however you want to define it for people did you need to use in order to get those, it was, I think you said 25-ish hours of video? How long was that?
For Rims, it was 2019 and 2020. I forget the exact number of sessions. That's in my paper though. So whenever that comes out, that'll give you the exact number. But I had specific sessions from Rims that I looked at, and then at Bimini, it was 2016 to 2017. So I was given the trips and encounters from that to look at, and thankfully, with RIMS, because of the volunteers at DCP from Sacred Heart, they had already coded the behavior. So when I was looking at that, I was just going in and coding for my elaboration sequences so I could look at the differences in the sequences. Whereas with Bimini, I had to go through all of that video coding myself and watch every single, and those are relatively shorter videos. So I was going through it and making sure, and I had a little bit of help because Nicole had coded some of that already. So I was just double checking on top of that to code the sequences and the actions that were occurring because they were kind of just a general, like, okay, they were playing with seaweed, but then I was looking at, okay, what are they doing with the seaweed? And so that
Mhm.
requires me to go in and sequence them in the actions that were occurring in the order that they happened.
Excellent. Thank you. And I think the last question, I'm checking on our time. If anyone has any other question, feel free to pop it in the chat. I will get to the last. I'm just scrolling to find it. Were you surprised that the wild population played as much for relative to the sample size as the managed care population? Did you expect to find more play among dolphins who have more free time, so to speak, who aren't foraging, who aren't avoiding predators? Were you expecting to see more object play from them?
I think in general, I kind of thought I would see longer uh I thought I would see longer ones at Rims, but I think they ended up being shorter because they do have a little bit more time. Whereas, like, as you mentioned, the difference with the wild population is that they do have to forage, they do have to find food. Whereas in a managed care situation, they have the husbandry, they have food, they have those times that are designated for that. So outside of that, they have the option to play more and maybe they feel like playing with a piece of a leaf or something, and then they're like, oh, I'm not interested in this anymore. But they have extra time, whereas like something else might occur in the wild where they may not have that time to play and object availability. So like if they have seaweed there, if they don't have an object to play with, they may not be playing with it. I mean, because they can play with fish too, but that wasn't as often. So I think it has to do with both, like the object availability and then like how much time do you have to devote to a non-functional behavior as opposed to what you need to devote to your functional behavior so that you can survive.
Yeah. Yeah. And maybe in Bimini, we're already observing them in that play time when
Mhm.
they can pause their survival things to check out the goofy humans who've, pulled up in a boat. So
Yeah.
maybe that factors in too. Excellent. Well, thank you so much for sharing all of that with us, Abby. And thank you to everyone who joined live. Thank you to everyone who is listening. And we hope that you will join us for another DCP webinar in the future. And when Abby's paper is out and the team's paper is out, we will be sure to let everyone know. So with that, we'll say goodbye and thank you.